Major breaking news involving the Merrick Garland Joe Biden Department of Justice and the Deep State. They're extremely angry that they've had to leave the District of Columbia, the heart of Deep State, to actually try a case involving President Trump in America, specifically in Florida, in front of Judge Aileen Cannon, who's actually requiring the Department of Justice to do its job in prosecuting Donald Trump, meaning we have a judge that's judging and not just rubber stamping what DOJ wants. Let's talk all about it when we get back. You're going to be happy when you hear it. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and author of the brand new best-selling book. Thank you very much, friends and family and fans. Best-selling book, Israel Disarm: What the October 7th Attacks Teach Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. We must always learn from the mistakes of others. The Israelis made terrible mistakes in not adopting a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms in their country, and the consequences were 1,200 people killed by Hamas in a terrorist attack because, unfortunately, their citizens were left defenseless when the government could not respond in time, and the consequences are, of course, horrible. So this book discusses this in great detail. It also talks about the history of the Jews, going all the way back, about how they developed sort of a history of being disarmed until they learned their lessons in 1948, formed their own country, and thereafter, unfortunately, today, seem to have forgotten those critical lessons and became complacent, feeling they could rely upon government for their protection. And unfortunately, on October 7th, 2023, they learned the hard way that was wrong and a bad idea. So check it out, Israel Disarm. All right, folks, so we have major breaking news. This is important because I have flagged this issue for you many, many months ago, and it's coming to fruition. Specifically, as you may recall, there's a special prosecutor appointed by Merrick Garland, the Department of Justice, by the name of Jack Smith. Now, Jack Smith was working as a prosecutor for a foreign sort of entity kind of thing, a court of criminal law over in Europe, and he was appointed to be the special prosecutor to target Donald Trump on various topics, including this quote-unquote national security, top secret document, stuff about whether or not he kept classified information and was he allowed to keep it after he left the White House, and so on and so on. Of course, we know what happened with Joe Biden. They decided not to prosecute because he was a doddering old man that wasn't mentally there. That's what the other special counsel that was focused on this with respect to Joe Biden decided. I think the man's name was Robert Hur, was the special prosecutor for Joe Biden. And now we're dealing with Jack Smith. Now, here's the key. Big news has just broken that an argument we flagged on this channel many months ago, i.e., does Jack Smith have legal authority to convene grand juries, to go after Donald Trump, to conduct these investigations, to indict Donald Trump, and to prosecute Donald Trump? Does Jack Smith have this legal authority or not? And the reason why I flagged the possibility, and we talked about this many months ago, why Jack Smith may lack that legal authority, is because he is functioning as what's known as an officer of the United States. He's not just an employee of the U.S. government. He's functioning as an officer of the United States, meaning he is functioning as if he is a United States attorney, as if he is the Attorney General of the United States, as if he were some sort of a high-level cabinet official. The reason why this is important is he's acting as if he has this position, but under the Constitution, to be an officer of the United States, you have to be appointed specifically by the President of the United States, meaning you have to be nominated by the President of the United States, step one. Then you have to be confirmed by the United States Senate, just like a Supreme Court justice. Donald Trump nominates Neil Gorsuch. The U.S. Senate has hearings about Neil Gorsuch, and they vote and they confirm Neil Gorsuch to the U.S. Supreme Court, which converted Judge Neil Gorsuch into Justice Neil Gorsuch. Well, the same idea is this. Merrick Garland, to be the Attorney General, had to be nominated by Joe Biden and then confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Now, Jack Smith has never, ever been nominated to any position by any president of the United States or confirmed by any Senate in any respect. Now, by the way, this is in contrast to Robert Hur, the independent counsel charged with looking at Joe Biden, because Robert Hur has previously been nominated as the President of the United States by the President of the United States and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. This is different than, guess who? Jack Smith. So, why am I bringing this up and why is this so important? Because it turns out that, as you recall, Jack Smith had to indict Donald Trump in Florida. He could not get away with what the Department of Justice likes to do, which is to indict everyone they don't like in the District of Columbia, which is their hometown, where all the jurors work for the federal government, where all the jurors like bureaucrats. If they don't work for the federal government, their spouse does, or their significant other does. And most of the judges on the D.C. Court of Appeals and on the D.C. trial courts all came from the District of Columbia. They're all basically part of the deep state establishment, the bureaucracy, the administrative state, the regulatory state, the DC world, whatever you want to call it. They all belong to the same country club in Bethesda or in McLean, Virginia, or you get the point, or hang out in Georgetown at dinner parties, yada, yada, yada. You get the idea. They're all part of that same swamp or pool, if you will. So once Jack Smith and the Department of Justice had to leave the cushy confines of their home turf, of their home stadium, where, judges half the time just rubber stamp what DOJ wants. This is part of the problem with the FISA court, by the way, which is based in D.C. The FISA court is supposed to be a check on the federal government being able to spy on American citizens using like CIA power and the like when U.S. citizens are talking to foreign nationals. And the FISA court is supposed to be there to protect our rights, even though nobody knows about it. Well, that's in D.C. too, with the typical D.C. deep state bias. So what happens when Jack Smith had to leave D.C. and go somewhere else in America to go get Donald Trump? Specifically, the indictment associated with the alleged classified documents case down there in Florida was in front of another federal judge, Judge Aileen Cannon, who is not a deep state creature. She's not a D.C. person. She actually lives in America. She lives in Florida. So, of course, what's happened here is that one of the legitimate arguments that was fronted in the D.C. Court of Appeals and then in front of the Supreme Court is, does Jack Smith have the legal authority to be doing any of this at all, given the fact he's never been nominated by the president or confirmed by the U.S. Senate, and thus cannot be a lawful constitutional officer of the United States? Is he basically acting what would be known in the law as ultra vires, meaning you're acting beyond the scope of your lawful authority? Well, it turns out that Judge Cannon was made aware of this by virtue of a series of motions made by the Donald Trump legal team. And Judge Cannon has now decided to schedule, as well she should, a hearing that's going to last a day or so as to whether or not Jack Smith has this authority. She's going to hear arguments from the Department of Justice. She's going to hear arguments from people that say constitutionally this is not true. And she's going to literally listen to this arguments by various parties. And what's interesting is that the deep state anti-Trumpers are all upset by the fact that Judge Cannon actually is going to listen to this argument and hear it and take it seriously, because they just want these federal judges to rubber stamp whatever the government wants. Whatever DOJ wants, they want the federal government the federal judges to simply rubber stamp and approve it sight unseen, which is, of course, not how it's supposed to work in America, where the presumption is toward freedom, the presumption is toward innocence and against the government. And when in doubt, the government's always supposed to lose. Now, in many aspects, the system has been flipped on its head. We'll talk about prosecutors at some point down the road and my views of them, my experience with them. I have quite a bit, and I have quite a few thoughts on these guys. But again, we'll cover that in a different video. So with that said, Judge Cannon is going to hear this hearing. And what's interesting is that the anti-Trumpers are so upset by this is they're complaining that Judge Cannon is actually going to entertain this argument, which of course she should, because if it turns out Jack Smith lacks this legal authority, it means every single indictment of Donald Trump by his office, all the grand jury work, all that legal work that was done has to be thrown in the trash, because we've all done ultra vires without authority. So it all goes away, not just with Donald Trump, but presumably with anybody else that Jack Smith indicted in the grand jury, because again, he would lack that authority under the law. So she's going to hear this argument. They're also upset, and this is kind of ironic, they're upset that Judge Cannon is allowing third parties to come in to argue in support and against this argument. And some people are upset that why are they allowing third parties to come in? But of course, as you know, because I train you from the Supreme Court litigation side of things, there's amicus briefs every single day in the U.S. Supreme Court where friends of the court, third parties come in and argue or make recommendations and whatnot. And it's not unusual for third parties to be able to be heard. Just think about it for a moment in the case of The Bruin case is a classic example. In 2022, the Supreme Court decided you have a right to carry guns outside the home under the Second Amendment. But if you remember back to that oral argument, you had the pro-Second Amendment lawyers were arguing for the Second Amendment. But then if you look at what happened on the pro-government side, the anti-Second Amendment side, the Solicitor General, as I recall, of the state of New York argued half of the time against the Second Amendment, and the other half of the oral argument time, or a considerable amount of the oral argument time, was argued by the United States Department of Justice Solicitor General, who was not a party to the Bruin case, but was still, as an outsider, as an amicus, was allowed to argue. So really allowing other people outside the case, if they have particular expertise or particular interest in the case, to come in and argue on behalf of one side or the other is not unusual in the least. In fact, that is exactly what's happening down there in front of Judge Cannon as to whether or not Jack Smith has legal authority to do what he's doing. There's going to be argument not just by Donald Trump's lawyers, but also by Jack Smith's lawyers, but there's also going to be argument by people outside the case with specific expertise in this area to argue both in support of Donald Trump that Jack Smith lacks the legal authority, and also on the other side to argue that Jack Smith does have this authority. And again, as I pointed out, this all turns on officers of the United States and what's known as the Appointments Clause. And the Appointments Clause requirements, they seem technical, but the reality is simply the president appoints, the Senate confirms or denies. That's it. Period. Full stop. And this is a very big deal because as you know, the way our system's supposed to work is we have three branches of governments. These checks and balances are very important. You have the courts against the Congress, against the presidency and the executive branch, and they're all supposed to be fighting amongst each other for power and whatnot. And in the result, according to founding fathers, was this protected our rights because it would not allow the consolidation of all the power of the government in one person, because they did not want to have a king created out of the government. Now, of course, you can argue there's a fourth branch of government that's been developed, the deep state, the civil service class, the regulatory class, the administrative state. I think it's a legitimate question as to whether, there's no doubt in my view that the regulatory state, the bureaucrats have far too much power in this government, in this country. And basically they view, and this has been said by others before, I think the administrative state, the regulatory state views the political class, the people that we, the people, elect to be the summer help, the summer interns. They come and go, but the deep state permanent bureaucracy never goes anywhere. So the same people that worked at the Census Bureau under Barack Obama are still working at the Census Bureau under Donald Trump, are still working at the Census Bureau under Joe Biden, and will still be working at the Census Bureau under the presidency of Donald Trump, Joe Biden, or Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Whatever happens, they will still be there, that permanent class of bureaucrats. So yes, I think there's a strong argument that we've built kind of a fourth class of government, a fourth branch of government that is the most dangerous class, these bureaucrats that think they're quote-unquote experts and can tell all of us what to do. But we'll talk about that history at another video. The bottom line is, it's very interesting that once the Department of Justice has to leave the District of Columbia and go handle matters outside of their little confines, when they have to be the visiting team, if you will, they don't do very well. And they're not doing that well, which is why down in Florida, Judge Cannon is doing her job, judging and listening to the arguments. And again, when you're dealing with a criminal case where someone can go to prison for literally years, if not decades, if I were a judge, I would be extremely careful to make sure that every conceivable argument that the criminal defendant had was properly vetted and analyzed, because again, you're dealing with someone's freedom here, their lives, and you don't want to mess around with this just because it's inconvenient to a bunch of bureaucrats and DOJ prosecutors that simply want judges to rubber stamp. And look, if I were a prosecutor and all I cared about was winning, yeah, I would want the judges to just rubber stamp my stuff too. It would make my life a lot easier. That's not the world I came out of, by the way. In my world of war, which was really literally like a world of metaphorical war, and the lawsuits I handled, it was like terrible. Everyone fought to the death over every single thing, and I never had the luxury of being a prosecutor where I could just ask the court to, hey, I represent the United States of America, please approve. No, I never had that luxury. It was always a very big fight, everything I touched. So I envy the job of prosecutors in the sense that it's a lot easier job than anything I ever touched in the law. But with that said, that's just not how the system's supposed to work. It's not how the system should should work. We really should be bending over backwards to protect Americans against government. And I'm glad that Judge Cannon, it seems to be at least doing that down in Florida in this case brought by Special Prosecutor Jack Smith against Donald Trump. And we'll see what happens. We'll keep you apprised. But again, this is a topic that we flagged a couple times on this channel many months ago. And as part of making you the smartest person in the room, I always try to be ahead of the curve because I want you to be smarter faster than anyone else, especially those on the other side of the fight for our freedoms and for our Constitution. So there you have it, folks. Hope you learned something here today at the Four Boxes Diner. Make sure you subscribe to this channel. Don't forget to follow me on X at Four Boxes Diner, and we will see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.